Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
Education has always seen this contrast between the practical and the dreamer, right? School taught us the basics. It helped us learn many of the skills that might relate to a career. But deep down, we never lost that thrill that comes with learning beyond the nuts and bolts of the marketplace, etc. You know, music and learning how the planets move within the solar system, learning what makes a great wine or how to use our fancy new DSLR camera, that kind of thing. And when we learn, it's really amazing how often we are surprised. For example, I've been enjoying Dr. Mark Stoller's lecture at the Great Courses Plus called The Skeptic's Guide to American History. He gets into the story of George Washington. Now, George Washington so often painted as this saintly character, this perfectly airbrushed icon of American history. But the truth is, he was a guy. He was a human being, flawed, with successes and failures. And the story of the real man beyond the myth is actually much more interesting. That's what the Great Courses Plus does. It makes learning a lot of fun on your schedule, streaming right into your life and helping you to every day discover something new. Make the Great Courses Plus your go-to for lifelong learning. For a limited time, they are offering my listeners a full free month of unlimited access to the entire course library. But to access the special offer, you have to sign up using my special URL. So start your free month today. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. Here in the United States, at least, one of the most well-known stories when it comes to right-to-die issues has to do with a young woman named Brittany Menard. 29 years old, this was the end of 2013. She's got tremendously horrible headaches. She goes in to get checked. They do a brain scan, and they see what looks like, to my eyes in the scan, a tumor about the size of a baseball inside her skull. It's unbelievable to look at. And they just told her outright, she had about 6 months to live. They could extend that with radiation and chemo, etc., but she'd still only likely get an extra few months, and the consequences, the side effects would be just horrible. And so she made the decision to take her own life, and that for her meant moving out of her home state of California, moving to Portland, where it is legal to take your own life in this way. And she did so surrounded by family and friends. And this was kind of a lightning rod of controversy at the time because people were, they were divided about whether or not she should have the right to do this. You can imagine most of the objections to it being religious ones. She's playing God. That's what I'd heard mostly. She's taking life and death into her own hands, and this is the domain of God alone. And of course, the rest of us were saying that she has every right to decide how she wants to go and to take some measure of control over this thing. She died in 2014 on her own terms. She died. And later on in the broadcast, in the final segment, I'm going to speak to Brittany's husband, Dan. He's going to tell us about Brittany. He's going to talk about what she had been going through and why this has become an issue for him, as he is now an advocate for other people who have been diagnosed with terminal illness and are being denied death with dignity options as they often experience tremendous suffering. Dan Diaz is going to join me for the last segment of the show, and then you will hear the voice of Brittany Menard herself to finish the broadcast. There's a woman named Kelly who had recently shared a story. She's a medical transcriptionist who lives in Arizona, and she was talking about her father, a jack of all trades, a man in his 70s who, He kind of had that rags to riches story. He grew out of poverty. He was the first in his immediate family to graduate from college, get an education, became a dentist. And he had just built this rich and wonderful life. He and his wife actually sort of pinballed back from one home to the other. They spent the summers in Seattle and the winters in Phoenix. He was a handyman. He was a builder. He could pretty much make it all out of wood or metal. He could cut it and mold it and fabricate it, weld it, form it, and imagine it into something really special. This was his thing. He kept a huge garden, just this massive garden on a wooded property. He raised chickens on the land, and he was a cook. He loved to bake. Kelly's dad was old school, that stereotypical man's man. He never went to the doctor. I'd always tell him if he got sick, you need to go to the doctor, or he'd injure himself. You need to go to the doctor. And he would just never go unless they practically dragged him there. And he just pushed through it. Whenever he got sick or wounded or whatever, he would just buckle up and suck it up. And that's just what men do. Kelly's mom started to notice something different about her husband. She noticed when she looked in his eyes that the whites of his eyes were no longer really white. That pristine white had turned to kind of a dull yellow. And so she had that conversation again, honey, you need to see a doctor. And he said, no, I'm serious, honey. You need to make an appointment and see the doctor. I'll be fine. Don't worry about it. I'm telling you, I'm going to call him myself. I will make the appointment. You are going to see the doctor. And that's how she got him there. The diagnosis from the doctor involved a word most of us likely have never heard before in our lives. Cholangiocarcinoma, bile duct cancer. This is a rare cancer. It's malignant. It's really nasty. In some cases, it's operable. And so Kelly's father went ahead and agreed to have the surgery. This is a tough one. This involves removing parts or all of the bile duct. They remove lymph nodes, partial removal of tissue from the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, from the stomach if necessary. Then there's chemo and radiation. This is really nasty stuff. And the surgery was, in fact, very invasive. Recovery from surgery was terrible beyond words. This guy, even in his 70s, who had been defined as a creator and a builder and a healer and a grower and a mover, well, he could now barely move at all. Yeah, he kept a brave face when he went back home to Seattle. This was April of 2017. He went back home and, he knew he was not getting better. He knew he was getting worse. This cancer over the following months had just overtaken his body from within, and it was irreversible. The doctor said unfixable. Kelly said she knew that her dad knew the prognosis even before he went in for the follow-up appointment. He knew that this cancer was going to kill him. Wasn't long after that doctor's appointment and the prognosis, Kelly's phone rang. It was her dad. He said, honey, I want you to call the doctor. I want you to call the doctor, and I want you to find a way to convince him to let me die. Now, Washington is one of only 7 states in the U.S. that actually has a death with dignity statute. There's only 7 out of the 50. The others are California, Colorado, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, New Jersey, Oregon, and Vermont. And the doctor was helpful, and he gave some suggestions, on who they might consult for this final exit. And they ultimately connected with an organization called End of Life Washington. And End of Life Washington talked with the family and listened to the family and addressed their concerns and questions and wants and needs. Kelly's dad just wanted to die on his own terms. Imagine the lack of control you feel. Your body's turned against you. You have inoperable cancer. You know that imminent suffering is coming. Maybe it's already here and it's just going to get worse. And he just wanted to have some measure of control over what was to come. He wanted to die on his own terms at his time, inside his home, in the place he loved, with the people he loved, with his wife and his children, maybe the grandchildren, being spoken to and touched and kissed and embraced and comforted. And he made the arrangements to do so without any hesitation. This was actually a form of comfort for him. Like he got a chance to get involved in the process and actually do something proactive instead of merely reacting to the cancer that was growing inside of his body. Kelly saw that his attitude actually changed after he did this. He went from stressed out and kind of depressed to more peaceful, more relaxed. It was strange. He took legitimate comfort in being able to regain some of the dignity of making a decision, choosing the where and the when, deciding the terms, having some control. If his life's going to end, he wouldn't be totally helpless. And he took a lot of comfort in the assurance that he would not be bankrupting his family either emotionally or financially. So they just decided to take it one day at a time, and when the time came, well, he would know it. Kelly's mom and dad spent that time reliving old memories, going through the photographs, making new memories, being together, sharing life, sharing memories, making plans, financial plans, talking to the attorneys about all that legal stuff that happens, So often it gets messy after someone passes. He was still alive, still able to participate in the process of saying, this is what I want to happen. Talking to the attorneys about all the legal stuff, clearing up any confusion about what was going to happen after. These are my wishes. This is what needs to happen. Or what would you like to happen? Allow me to help to facilitate that. What are the family's wishes? Don't grieve me. Don't mourn me. Don't spend your time being sad about me. But celebrate my life, remember me, and go out and live your own life with as much joy as you can. That was so empowering to this guy. It was the 25th of September, 2017. Kelly's dad had just become so weak. He couldn't care for himself really anymore. He had barely the energy to make a phone call or even get up and walk to the next room. He was starting to become incontinent. He's starting to lose control of his body to a degree that he realized the time had come. This is it. This is the right time. And so he made a phone call. He called the volunteers over at End of Life Washington. He said, look, I'd like you to come by tomorrow because tomorrow is the day. And he told his family as well. I'm sure he told them first, tomorrow's the day. Everybody be ready. And they'd been preparing themselves. They knew that the time was coming and it was relatively soon. Tomorrow's the day. And so he got up that morning and he ate breakfast and he enjoyed time with his family. And when he was ready at his time, on his terms, he drank a final cocktail. And then he went gently, peacefully to sleep. And after he was ultimately carried away in preparation for the funeral, his family stayed together. And they sat around the dinner table that very night and they celebrated his life. They grieved the loss, but also felt an assurance that this guy had died just like he had lived on his own terms, surrounded by his people with dignity. Now, what I've just told you is a true story. It is listed among many personal accounts on the Death with Dignity Stories page. I wanted to start with this because, we're going to talk a lot about the legalities of right to die and legislation and all those types of things and how religion often plays a part in trying to control people's decisions, personal bodily autonomy, etc. But I wanted this to really be about the human story, rooted in the human condition. This legislation affects people at some of the most raw and vulnerable times of their lives. I'm going to speak with a stage 4 cancer patient who is navigating these waters. I'm going to talk with an attorney, Robert Revis. He's general legal counsel for an organization called the Final Exit Network. He's an attorney who's been out there on the front lines in the courts when it comes to right to die and the often religious opposition to it. I'm going to provide some resources for people who are navigating the gauntlet of these discussions in their own circles. And I just want it said right here at the top of the show, everything that you and I are about to do is not designed to minimize or cheat the value of life. It's designed rather to protect and promote the right of every human being in regard to their own body. This broadcast deals with the rights of people to live without being told how to live, but also to be able to end suffering, die with dignity, without being told how to do so by someone else. Let's see what our listeners have to say as we go to the switchboard. I've got Samantha. Samantha, you're on the Thinking Atheist podcast. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Seth?
I'm well. We're talking about a very serious subject, death with dignity, the right to die issue. What do you think?
I think that that's a right that we extend to our beloved animals, to our pets that bring us so much joy. And I will never understand why we don't extend that same dignity to our human loved ones.
Do you have any experience with this in your own life?
I do. So there's kind of a two-part thing here. For the last probably 10 years, I have driven to work, and I work in Dubuque, Iowa, and I pass these billboards that are put up by the Dubuque Right to Life Coalition. And there's, I don't know how many of them throughout the town, and I probably pass 4 of them every day. And for about the last 7 years, they showed these giant bloody handprints, and they were a protest against Planned Parenthood in Dubuque. And about 2 years ago, they successfully lobbied Planned Parenthood out of Dubuque. And as soon as that Planned Parenthood closed, these billboards immediately switched to showing a woman who is obviously a cancer patient. And there's a big sign that says, "Don't help me die, help me to live," on these billboards. Now, much like Planned Parenthood in Dubuque never offered abortions, Iowa's never had physician-assisted suicide. That's never even something that comes up regularly in legislative session. So they're arguing against a straw man, this boogeyman that doesn't exist. And for someone whose mom does have cancer, and we've had to sit down and have some pretty serious discussions about that, they make me really angry because it's just an empty feel-good platitude, "Help me to live." These extremists can say that while they're patting themselves on the back, but what kind of life are we talking about really for a terminally ill patient? It's not it's not a life that's free from suffering.
It's kind of a Crayola philosophy, isn't it? It's like it has nothing to do with suffering or those with terminal illness or personal autonomy, bodily autonomy. It ignores all of that for the sort of bumper sticker, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's like they don't have any concept of what life really is at either end, being born or dying. And if they really cared about life, about the quote-unquote sanctity of life that they claim to, they should want a life full of dignity to the end with no suffering, or, as much as we can minimize that, not this, charade that lets them sleep better at night while they're actually doing the least bit possible.
Samantha, I'm sorry to hear about your mom. You can share or not share. You said you had some difficult conversations. Did it sort of step into these waters, of what happens if?
Yes. So my mom was diagnosed with leukemia when I was a junior in high school. So that's been 15 years ago. And back then she was given 3 to 5 years. And we, tried different treatments and got to within the point, it was less than a month away of her having a bone marrow biopsy, a complete and full bone marrow biopsy. And we'd gone through all that training and things weren't looking great. But right before she was supposed to have the biopsy, her doctor came to her and said, "Let's try one more thing. There's an experimental drug treatment program that I think that you're a drug study that I think you would be a really good candidate for. Let's see how that goes." And, without getting into all the details of it, science is incredible because after a little bit of trial and error, this drug pushed her into remission, and she has to just take a pill now for the rest of her life. And it controls the leukemia.
That's amazing. Imagine if she'd been diagnosed and treated 50 years ago. Many of these options wouldn't exist, right?
Absolutely. But it was pretty bad for a while. And she actually came to me and we had a pretty serious sit-down conversation where she said, if I'm ever to the point where I'm suffering to the point of being incapacitated, right or wrong, I know is because you're my daughter and this is hard for me to ask of you, but I need you to advocate for me. I do not want to live as a vegetable. I absolutely do not want that. She was very clear on that. And she said, so if I can't use my voice, I need you to be my voice and, pull the plug or whatever needs to be done. But I don't want to live like that. That's not living. And those were almost verbatim her words to me. And I'm very lucky that I didn't have to make that choice, or I haven't had to make that choice yet, because she's, been pushed so close to remission. She's doing great now. But I look back at pictures of her from that time, and you're looking at someone who is so very obviously in pain. She barely looked like a person. And, she managed to get better, but there's so many people who don't, that they just keep suffering. They keep getting worse. And when they put those billboards up that just say, "Help me to live," and empty, I just want to sleep good at night, pat myself on the back kind of platitude, because they've obviously never had to look at a loved one who is suffering like that.
Samantha, have you had the same sort of internal discussion about your own? I mean, we're all mortal. Like, when my time comes, have you gone down that road at all in your head?
Yeah, and I think that I would want my loved ones to show me enough compassion to make that same choice. Because at that point, there's no life left. That's not a life. That's not anything that is, full of the human experience. That there's no joy there.
Well, Samantha, thanks for sharing your perspective and your story. I am hugging you, and your mom didn't even know me. Just hugs from Seth, and we're so glad that she's had some success, a lot of success with her treatment, and I think we're all on her side and pulling for her and all those things. So it sort of brings the whole discussion to life, and I appreciate you sharing that part of your life with us, okay?
All right. Thank you so much.
In my preparation for the broadcast, I was introduced to a documentary that was hosted by Terry Pratchett, famous novelist, most famous for the Discworld series, sold 85 million copies of his novels over his lifetime. He'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he died in 2015. But the documentary really wasn't as much about him. It was just him hosting a show called Choosing to Die. It was this one-time, one-off TV documentary produced for BBC Scotland. And he gets into these right-to-die issues. This is, of course, something that was close to his heart, because he realized that his own death was imminent. And in fact, he was a big patron of Alzheimer's research and a supporter of right-to-die issues across the UK and beyond. I think that's why he wanted to host the documentary. And the movie largely focuses around the story of this English millionaire, this hotel owner named Peter Smedley. Peter Smedley was diagnosed 11 years ago with motor neurone disease, and there's no cure. He knew that his death was coming, and he wanted to take some control over it. And at the very end of the documentary, they take cameras into the room where Peter and his wife are sitting. They have a representative from an organization called Dignitas. I hope I'm saying that right. Dignitas. And they work with him. They assist him on ending his own life. And the cameras are rolling from the agreement. Are you sure you want to do this? And then they have this, Dixie cup filled with a concoction that will put him to sleep and then stop all of the systems in his body. Now, I thought for just a second about playing the audio of that, but I immediately decided against it. It's on YouTube if you want to see it, but that's something I think you should do on your own terms. It's a very intimate moment. It's a very sobering moment. I will describe to you what it was like watching this from my own home. I mean, I got goosebumps. I felt a tremendous sense of reverence, and Terry Pratchett is there, and he's sitting directly across from them. He's sitting in his chair, just silent, just watching the whole thing. And you can see he's tremendously moved and sobered by this experience. And Peter Smedley takes the Dixie cup. It's probably got a quarter of a cup of semi-clear liquid in it. And he drinks it down. And he sits back and he waits while his wife is rubbing his right hand. He's lucid for about a minute. He looks around the room, thanking everyone. Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then all of a sudden you see him begin to glaze over a little bit. He's still sitting up on the couch. And his words begin to slur, and he asks for a drink of water. But, that time has passed. He almost immediately falls into unconsciousness. He begins snoring. And the woman from Dignitas, the representative, is educating everybody in the room. He's asleep. This has been totally pain-free. He's now just deeply unconscious. He feels nothing. He's snoring. And in another few seconds, the processes of his body will stop and he will be gone. And that's exactly what happened. And the camera's there, quietly, nobody's speaking. You just see Peter Smedley sitting back at kind of a hard angle on the couch. He, in just a very brief period of time, slipped into unconsciousness and died on camera. I can see why it would have been controversial to air this. But he agreed to have that story told, I think, because he wanted to destigmatize it, to demystify it, to show people what it's like at the end, that we should not necessarily be afraid of death or the process of dying, and that he felt it was critical that people see someone taking control of the final seconds of their life. If you want to see the clip, it is on YouTube. It is called Assisted Suicide of Peter Smedley, Unedited. Heavy stuff. In fact, there's a disclaimer at the beginning. You have to click through to be able to watch the video. So you've been warned, but it is an important piece of this larger puzzle, and it's there as a resource for those who would like to go that deep into this discussion about right to die. Let's talk to someone else who's been on the front lines of these discussions. Robert Revis. He is general counsel for an organization called the Final Exit Network, supporting the human right to a death with dignity. Robert Revis, thanks so much for being here.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
For members of my audience who aren't familiar with your background, can you kind of give us the Cliff Notes, kind of how you are speaking to the death with dignity question?
Well, I'm an attorney in Florida, and I lived in Palm Beach County, West Palm Beach, for many years. And while I was there, now I live in Tallahassee. But while I was in Palm Beach County, the ACLU and the Hemlock Society of America came to me and asked me to be involved in a sort of precedent-setting landmark lawsuit against the state of Florida, seeking to establish that there's a constitutional right to physician aid in dying under specific circumstances. We won that case in the trial court. It got nationwide publicity, and it was remarkable that there had been no court that had ever ruled that way. But then the Supreme Court of Florida, some 6 months later, reversed, so we didn't really accomplish anything in the end. But ever since then, I've been engaged by different Right to Die organizations, and now I'm general counsel for the Final Exit Network. And it's in that capacity that I speak here today.
Can you tell us what some of the arguments you are hearing against Right to Die legislation?
Well, that's a very broad question. You know, the word right to die refers to things that range from the ability to either decline or disconnect artificial life support if the artificial life support would enable you to survive. That's a right to die issue. It was first called that back in the 70s when that sort of issue first came up. Of course, now it's virtually clearly understood everywhere that a person has a right to refuse medical treatment. And so then the next question is, can they have a surrogate or an appointed healthcare guardian give the instruction to turn off life support? And that's pretty well established now that they can. Another issue that's just burning across the country right now, that's the biggest issue of the day, is that states one by one are enacting laws authorizing a physician to provide a lethal medication to somebody who's qualified under very exacting criteria in order to enable them to take the drugs to terminate their own suffering, to end their lives. It is often called physician-assisted suicide, although we don't use that term because it's used to make the concept sound absurd, and it's not absurd. But there are now in 8 states, 9 jurisdictions, if you count the District of Columbia, that have enacted physician aid in dying laws. You can call them PAD laws for physician aid in dying, or it could alternatively mean physician-aided death. But those are being passed in additional states year after year.
You hear a lot of protests talking about the medical profession. What I have often heard and what I said when I was in the church was, don't corrupt the medical establishment. They are supposed to be healers. And so we saw them as if they're facilitating death, even to end suffering. We rationalized that it was somehow a cheat of what the Hippocratic Oath represented. Can you speak to that?
Well, the Hippocratic Oath also calls upon doctors to make a choice to pray to either the god Aeschylus or the god Apollo. So they have to decide which one they're going to pray to. I don't think very many doctors in America today pray to either one, so they clearly don't believe the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is long, and it's got a bunch of stuff in it that's hard to understand. And it was interpreted in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s on the exact same theory, to prohibit the medical profession from participating in abortions. The American Medical Association and the conservative wing of the doctors in America have always cited the Hippocratic Oath to support whatever choice they choose to believe about medical issues. And this is just once again where they're abusing the Hippocratic Oath or using the Hippocratic Oath in the same way some people use the Bible to establish that people have to take every extraordinary measure because suffering is redemptive and it's part of God's plan for our lives.
You mentioned abortion. We got to talk a little bit about, in the recent ruling in Alabama. This is, in many cases, about controlling other people's lives. It's, stripping their individual choices and dictating what is the moral act or what they think is the moral act. How much of this, in your opinion, I know it's a subjective answer, how much of this is about control?
I think it's all about control, and I think that abortion and physician aid and dying have many things in common, and one thing to make them different. What they have in common is that there are religious doctrines against them, and they both involve whether or not a person can do with that person's own body what that person alone chooses to do, even when it doesn't hurt anybody else on earth. An abortion is like that. Physician aid and dying is like that. And in the same way that the religious right still tries to eliminate abortions, they try to eliminate physician aid and dying to come up with these propaganda tools like, are we a culture of life or a culture of death? It's just a ludicrous series of words that have no meaning. But in my world, in the litigation that I do for Final Exit Network, we find again and again that the people who are motivated to oppose physician aid and dying because for religious reasons, they know that they're going to be called out and they're not going to be successful if they come out and admit, oh, I believe this because it's what God says. They know they can't say that. So they invent secular reasons. That's why they invented this list of horribles about physician aid and dying is going to cause old people to feel compelled to die and responsibility to die, and it's going to pick on the weak, the disabled, the poor. All of those things have been proven in all of the states that have physician aid and dying to be false.
It used to be the death panels. This was usually in regard to the healthcare question. The death panel reference was made up by, what's her name from Alaska, Sarah Palin, and it was just complete rubbish. All the death panels were that in writing the federal rules for Obamacare, the authors of it decided that they ought to include, just as Medicare does, if you go see a doctor to make advanced care planning for your death, to be educated and make choices and tell your doctor, I don't want you to use a ventilator under these circumstances. I don't want you to revive my heart under these circumstances. You decide what you want. Tell your doctor what you want, and the program, Obamacare, or as it was before, Medicare or Medicaid, will pay for the doctor. That's all it did, and it's just to pay to doctors to enable people to make their own informed choices. And it has, death panels is just garbage terminology. Well, we've seen a lot of fear pimping in, Trumpistan. We see a lot of the evangelical right warning about not just moral decay, but, those who want right to die issues and abortion, a woman's right to choose, those types of things. They're trying to come in and dehumanize human beings. And it's funny because now, I think it's dehumanizing to strip their autonomy away and to deny them basic human rights.
Yeah, and these are the same people that believe the guy should be president who believes he can grab every woman by the pussy.
The irony is thick, my friend. Let's talk. How do we change this without changing the culture, right? I mean, how do you get legislation to pass in the Florida Supreme Court unless Florida becomes a more enlightened state on this issue? Is it a sort of a ground up grassroots thing? What do we do?
I don't know the answer to that. I only know that I've lived in Florida all my life, and the electorate of Florida is not going to change to become progressive thinking. Not while I'm alive.
Is that a religious thing, though? I mean, because they're a largely religious state?
Yes, that's really the primary thing. An overabundance of people who believe that their religion should be the source of wisdom upon which our government is based. And they don't understand that means that they're no better than the Taliban.
Can we get existential here for just a second? The difference between existing and truly living. I mean, that's really one of the main questions beyond the suffering question. It's, are you drawing breath or are you genuinely alive? Do you sort of get into the philosophy of what you do?
I get into it all the time. As a matter of fact, I don't think we have any choice but to be existential all the time. The question is, do we let people make their own decisions about that? We could all philosophize, but each one of us is just philosophizing about what we think. And the object of right to die laws, like the object of the legalization of abortion and the legalization of some other things, is to allow people to think what they think and believe what they believe and carry out their plan for their own lives in the way that they believe in, without having somebody else's religion forced upon them. How could you possibly deny a person the right to say, when I am no longer existing except as a mass of protoplasm with a brain stem that's causing my heart and lungs to continue functioning for an untold length of time, how can I not have the right to direct in advance that if I'm in that condition, I'd be allowed to die? And the only answer to that is from the people who believe you should be kept alive is that that's what the law says. And sometimes they even argue that it's unethical for doctors to do it because it's against the law. These are people actually trot out the argument that if it's against the law, it must be medically unethical.
What I usually hear in Oklahoma is, you're playing God. This is God. Only God decides when that final heartbeat happens.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. It's like these religious people who say only God can decide when your last breath takes place. Well, somebody's last breath took place back before somebody put them on a ventilator. So the person who put them on a ventilator is the one that's playing God. When you turn off the ventilator, you're just enabling God's will to be carried out. God wants to take the person home, and people who use ventilators are just playing God, and you can apply that to a much broader sphere of things that are done to help people stay alive, and sometimes they don't want them to be done, and if they're left alone, then God's will takes place.
You've been really generous with your time, Robert. Before I lose you here, let's talk about Final Exit.
www.finalexitnetwork.org. Now, there is a separate organization created by the founders of the Right to Die movement, Derek Humphrey. It's called www.finalexit.org. Not to be confused with that. FinalExitNetwork.org is our organization, and if you go to the website, it teaches you all about what we do. It's got a lot of detail. We provide people who are well-trained. We call them exit guides. They go to people who have decided that they're ready to terminate their suffering, and the exit guides educate them about how to do it in a manner that, well, I don't want to make a joke out of this, but in a safe manner. Safe meaning that there's nothing worse if you want to terminate your suffering and die than to do it wrong and be worse off. And so Final Exit Network teaches people how to do it right, how to do it with tools that are readily available to everybody so that you don't have to tell your doctor, who might send you to the psychiatric unit right away. You don't have to tell anybody except the people you want to know, if any, and Final Exit Network will give you the information, education, and moral support you need to accomplish the task in your own home. Final Exit Network pays for all the travel expenses for guides, so it's done any place in the country. And we're very proud of what we do. people sometimes call us secretive, but the only reason that in some sense it may appear as if we're sometimes secretive is because it's so urgent for us to protect the client's individual privacy. We can't have the world know that the person's about to do it, or the cops will come and do a wellness check and take them to a psychiatric hospital, or maybe they just didn't want any of their descendants or offspring ever to know the choice that they made at the end of their lives. And if so, that's a sacred prerogative of theirs, and we want to respect that. So Final Exit Network appears at times to be secretive, but it's only, there's nothing secretive about what we do. It's all out there on the website, but the secretive aspect is only to protect people's privacy.
It's been an honor to speak with you. Thanks for lending your expertise to a very important conversation, and I'll include the link in the description box of this broadcast. Thank you again.
Very good. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
If you will, allow me to take a real short break. I'll be right back. Going to talk to a gentleman who wanted to share part of his story. His name is Matt. He's been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and he has a first-person view of the right to die issue. He's going to speak with us next. Hang on. Let me tell you about one of the ultimate life hacks. Somebody says, hey, have you read this book? Have you listened to this book? You used to not have the time in your schedule, but with Blinkist, you do have the time, because Blinkist is the only app that takes the best key takeaways and the need-to-know information from thousands of nonfiction books and condenses them down to about 15 minutes. It's just awesome. It's made for people on the go who love to read, who love to listen to audiobooks, who want the info, and they want to be able to apply that info to their lives even faster, but they juggle with the everyday schedule. Blinkist makes it possible to enjoy an entire book on your morning commute, your lunch break, an evening walk. I was out on a walk with Linus. I was able to listen to the entire Blinkist version of Richard Dawkins' The Magic of Reality. I mean, it's a great book in its long form, but on the go, Blinkist made it possible to enjoy it in about 20 minutes. Another fantastic offering that I think is really relevant for this day and age is called Factfulness. 10 Reasons You're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. It's written by Von Hans Rosling. With Blinkist, you get unlimited access to read or listen to a massive library of condensed nonfiction books. All the books you want, and all for one low price. Right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for this audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Seth to start your free 7-day trial. That's 7 days of unlimited free access to read or listen to Blinkist's massive library of books. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist. Blinkist.com/Seth to start your free 7-day trial. Blinkist.com/Seth. My patrons get this show early. They get it totally commercial free. Thank you so much for your support at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. We're talking about right to die issues. So often the protests against them are religiously motivated. Who are you to play God? Who are you to take your own life? If you're part of the Catholic Church, suicide means an automatic and eternal ticket to hell. So you've got entire cultures of people who have been conditioned by superstition to walk away from the issue entirely. Don't touch it. It's radioactive. You cannot and you should not play God, if you'll forgive me for using the language of the church. Our conversation on this issue continues with a gentleman named Matt, who wanted to share his own story. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
It's going well. It's an honor to be talking with you.
What are your thoughts, my friend?
Well, I'm a stage 4 cancer patient. I was diagnosed back in 2013 at an earlier stage, and I went through treatment, was clean for almost 5 years. It took all the surgery and chemo and radiation and chemo again and all that, and it returned in a way that is probably not going to be operable. And I'm looking at 2 or 3 years and decent years on top of that.
I'm so sorry,
and,
man. I mean, I'm here. Forgive me for interrupting. I'm sitting here on the other end of the line thinking, I don't know what to say except, holy shit. And I'm hugging you from all the way over here, man, Oh,
Oh, I appreciate that. It's strange. It's one of those diseases that I had no risk factors. I was 43, athletic. Mostly organic diet, everything. I was required by my job and my sport to be in good shape, and it just happened. And I've never been ill from the disease. I've only been ill from the treatment. And it's kind of one of those things. It just happens to some people.
May I ask what state you live in or what region you live in?
I'm in Texas. And I don't want to take this too far, but 2 weeks ago when you had I watched your live stream where you were talking about Christian music and all that stuff. I'm from right where Friday Night Lights happened. Quite literally had a front row seat. I was a photographer for the school newspaper. I'm the same age as you, and I got to see the Power Team and Petra and all that. Wow. all at the same time.
I covered a lot of the same ground, huh?
Oh yeah. We have a similar. I almost went to seminary once. There's a lot of commonality.
Well, let me ask you this, because I'm navigating this side of the conversation. As someone who's going through this, what do you want people to say to you, or what do you want people to not say?
Well, I can tell you, most people, I have friends across the religious political spectrum, and they have one thing in common, is they're good people. And they say what they can, they offer help, and, specific things. That's the best thing you can do. Tell them, hey, I know somebody's been through this, and you need me to, mow your yard or go to the store or whatever. And it's nice to know that they can. If people approach it from a religious standpoint, you kind of look at that, like, if it helps them, so be it. That's fine. That's not my approach.
So if they look at you and they say, I'm praying for you, that's the way they've been taught to show empathy and compassion. We don't necessarily receive that as a kick in the teeth or condescension. It may just be their way, how they've always known to say, look, I'm hurting for you and I love you. And
it's you understand religion, your religion, whatever you're in, especially if it's kind of a regional thing, like where you and I grew up, same kind of places, that's your culture. That's what you do. As far as what not to say, I don't have a whole lot there because most people have been so kind. I've gotten into some uncomfortable stuff over, conspiracy theories. And the only uncomfortable thing, if anybody, that people do just sort of inadvertently when they find out, is the first thing that some folks will do, and I've had other patients do this, actually in the chemo room, is run down story after story of every painful, languishing death of every cancer patient they've ever known. Right? Oh, my aunt had that, and it was horrible, and it's terrible. And she, like, dude, I don't want to hear that. I'm not there yet. I don't want to deal with that. That's how it is. But the vast majority of people approach it from a standpoint of love and understanding and disbelief and things like that. And it's scary. I had a conversation with a friend who we spent our entire careers together, and he said, man, it's scary because if you can get it, anybody can get it. Like that hits home when the organic food eating annoying workout guy at the office gets it. It's sort of how they see it.
So there you are in Texas, and there's not exactly a progressive right to die attitude in that particular state. Are you going through some of these conversations?
I have, and the vast majority of people that I've spoken to, friends, and again, I don't have a huge public presence about disease and treatment. I've done some writing and things, but I haven't approached that. It came up in some local media, and it didn't really, I guess it hit me when I heard some people talking about it on air and social media from the standpoint of religion, saying that it's only God can decide when it's your time. It's not, if you have to languish or whatever, that's God's decision. And I thought about that, and when you look at other debated topics like this, like abortion, if you squint your eyes real hard, you can kind of see the point of the other side. You understand where they're coming from, even if you don't agree. This one, I can't make sense out of that line of thinking in any way. And part of that is when you're diagnosed with the disease, you have options, and one of your options is to do nothing. And you can seek treatment. And what treatment is, in my case, it can lengthen your life if you're in a position where you can't be cured. So if I choose not to do it, I'm shortening my life. And then that begs the question, okay, well, what about a DNR? If you sign a DNR, even if you're perfectly healthy, how does that fit that ideology? And you have to understand the complexity of dying from a disease like this. You don't know what it's going to be. It can be quick. It can be not quick. And the accepted option, if you are going and you go into palliative care, is they pump you full of opiates and you're essentially unconscious until your heart stops. And my question is, what's the difference? And people see it as, I've heard the whole coward's way out and all that thing. Well, when I hear those opinions, my question is, what is your skin in the game? When I hear somebody say only God can decide, how many people have you sat at their bedside? And do you understand what that does to your family? And then about the realities of it, it's not always like in the movies where grandma's laying in the bed with her floral knitted Afghan and you hold her hand and kiss her goodbye and she's gone. There's a lot of ugly reality that's in that. And especially if you're not in a position to be cared for in a hospital or something, you have to deal with all of that ugliness and your family has to deal with it. And that leaves a lot of lasting emotional impact on them. And that's their last memory of it.
So I don't even know if I can ask this, or I should ask this.
No, throw it out there.
Are you prepared if it comes to that? And I'm an optimist and I'm pulling for you and everybody. I'm sure in our listening audience, we're like, you can beat this and keep kicking and don't give up. And we're saying all the things that sound so cliche, but what we really mean, right? I mean, the world is better with you in it. And we want you to survive and thrive and beat this thing. But if it comes to that moment, do you in your own life, have you made a decision about picking the time and place that you call it quits?
I've given it thought, and this is hard to answer. And I am, like I said, I'm on a lot of chemo right now. This is a good day, so my brain sometimes slips out of gear. But that is a question I will answer differently this very moment when I feel well, and tomorrow about 4:00 when I'm staggering out of chemo. Because when you feel the effects of that treatment with the weight on you and you're going through all of the hot flashing, the nausea and your brain's mush and you're weak and the effects on the skin, it gets for a few days, it's tough to walk. I can't play guitar. I can't hold a conversation. Fortunately for me, that's a short period, but during that period, I think I can understand it. I can totally understand doing that, making the decision. Let's do it now, because it's if I had to give an analogy, it's that moment when you wake up with that severe hangover and you say, I'm never going to drink again, because you understand how that feels at that very moment. But later on, when you feel good and you're hanging out with your friends, you don't remember the pain and the discomfort that much. Yeah. So in the darkest moments, definitely I could see that being an option. Not only for me and the pain, that can all be mitigated, but for what my family has to deal with. Having sat bedside with dying people more than once, I understand it. There's only so much of your spouse having to change diapers that you want to subject them to.
Matt, is there anything we can do for you, man? I mean, right now you've got to have some kind of need that we can help with. I just feel like we
honestly,
have an opportunity.
I appreciate it. I'm actually I'm still working. I'm kind of gearing up for retirement, and I'm 50% of the time, even on my bad days, I can get up and do things. My wife and I have worked hard. My son's grown. We have resources, and I'm actually in a position to help other people, which we've done. And but no, honestly, just a chance to kind of talk about this subject and bring a little reality to it, and from somebody who's looking at it is very much gift enough.
Chemotherapy or not, you are a better communicator during this call than I am on many of my live streams. You know what I'm saying? So you did great. Yeah, you're apologizing because you're not speaking in a fluid way, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I think you're a great communicator. And
I was teasing, so I told the neighbor the other day I was going to borrow something, or they were going to loan me something. I told them, you have to remember when you're dealing with somebody that's on chemo, just kind of picture Tommy Chong when you talk to him, because the memory window is kind of it's kind of in and out. So yeah. I can lose myself in the middle of the sentence sometimes.
All right. Well, honestly, if your situation changes, if there's something that we can do, you just drop me a line. You got family all over the world as of right now. Okay, Matt?
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Real fast, let me take one more very short break. When I come back, I'm going to talk to Dan Diaz. Dan's going to tell the story of his wife, Brittany Menard, who was 29 when diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor and decided to take her own life. And that story became an international story as we talked about right to die issues. Dan now travels the country as an advocate for right to die issues, and he's going to join me for a conversation about Brittany, about her life, about her death, and why he is now helping other people who are now where Brittany was just a few years ago. I'm going to talk to Dan right after this. Hang on. Just a few years ago, there was this major news story about a young woman named Brittany Menard, 29. She married her husband, Dan Diaz, in September of 2012, and yet just over 2 years later, she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And with just a few months to live, and faced with the reality of tremendous suffering in store for her in the final days, weeks, even months of her life, Brittany moved out of California to Oregon so she could take advantage of Oregon's death with dignity law. She would take drugs prescribed by a doctor that would essentially put her to sleep forever. And on November the 1st, 2014, Brittany Menard did so. Joining me to talk about Brittany, her life, her death, and death with dignity issues is Dan Diaz. Dan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I thank you for the opportunity.
I wish it was under different circumstances that we were having this discussion. I'll say at the outset that you determine the boundaries here. So if I ask a question or we get into Brittany's story in a way that, this was private, you don't want to talk about it, you determine that, okay? We're totally cool with you deciding where you want to go and how far, all right?
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Let's start by talking about Brittany herself. We hear a lot about the circumstances, but I want to know more about Brittany. Can you start by kind of painting a verbal picture of who she was and what she was like?
Sure. Brittany Menard, a energetic, determined, at times to me, larger than life person. And here's someone that we met in 2007. We started dating. We were both living in Oakland. She had just graduated from UC Berkeley. And just a caring, adventurous, loving person. Once we started dating and as we were getting to know each other and falling in love, for her, the trips that we would take, she grew up in Southern California, San Diego, so the beach, that was always her thing. But then it kind of shifted towards lakes and mountains and rivers. And so she'd want to go camping. She'd want to, for our honeymoon, instead of going to a warm destination, we were hiking glaciers in Patagonia. She summited Mount Kilimanjaro. She summited the tall peak in Ecuador, Cotopaxi. She worked in an orphanage on her own dime for 6 months in Nepal. She visited Southeast Asia and just spent time exploring. So I guess her travel and her desire to be outdoors is probably a good descriptor, or would give the audience a good feel of who she was. So I share those details because, yes, she was a real person, not just this singular issue, medical aid in dying. Brittany Menard was so much more than that.
If we can, I mean, when the diagnosis came back, I'm sure the symptoms arrived. You go to get checked out and, all of a sudden you realize what you're facing. Can we talk about your approach to the news, her approach to the news, and how this led into the decision that she made to move to Portland?
Sure. So we were actually up in wine country. Brittany and I live in Northern California, just outside of San Francisco. We had bought a home together in 2012. We'd gotten married that year. And it was New Year's Eve of 2014. So December 31st, 2013, we were in wine country, Healdsburg, actually. She had been having headaches for a few months, and I'm kind of skipping over a bunch, but these headaches were there. They'd wake her up in the middle of the night. She'd start throwing up. She would be unable to go back to sleep. But on that day in particular, we had just finished lunch. She was throwing up, and I said, "Sweetie, we have to go to the emergency room." So we went to the emergency room. The physician says that he sees a shadow on the CT scan that he had ordered, which meant that we had to get her to a facility, a larger facility, so they could do an MRI. And essentially the following day, New Year's Day, January 1st of 2014, we discovered that brain tumor. And it was very large, and there's no cure for this. The tumor... The number of physicians that we had say to us that's the biggest tumor that they personally had seen. At first, of course, is scary. After a while, we just got used to it because, yes, that was the reaction by a lot of the medical professionals that were working on her case. But it's just something that punches you in the chest, and we're just completely shocked. Here's a healthy, vibrant individual, and you look at the screen, the image of that tumor, and Brittany's thinking, how can something that large be growing in her skull, and how can she, up until that point, had never suffered any symptoms? And the answer is that it was growing very slowly for as long as physicians, most of them said 3 years, 5 years, some said as much as 10 years when that tumor may have, the genesis of it, when it started growing. Complete shock. 10 days later, Brittany had brain surgery at UCSF Medical Center. And at that point, they said that she likely had 3 years to live, 3, maybe 5 years to live. She's 29 years old, mind you. So for her, receiving that news, it just destroyed our hopes, our thoughts of we just gotten married. We have plans for a family, and now we're dealing with the chaos of a brain tumor. It was 2 months later then, at the first follow-up MRI after that brain surgery, when that MRI showed that all of a sudden the tumor was growing aggressively, indicative of a GBM, a glioblastoma multiforme. That's the most aggressive type of brain cancer. It's the same cancer that killed Senator John McCain, as an example. It doesn't matter if you're Senator McCain, Senator Ted Kennedy, Beau Biden, that was Joe Biden's son not too long ago. A GBM is terribly efficient, unfortunately, of ending a person's life. And so with that news, Brittany then said that, she will continue to battle against this brain tumor, but she will wage that battle against this cancer from Oregon, because at least there she knows she has the option, should it become necessary, but she would have the option of a gentle dying process utilizing Oregon's death with dignity law that at that point they'd had for 16 years.
Dan, was that a conversation that she also had? And again, you let me know how much you want to share, but I mean, that's a tough one to share with mom and dad, that not only is this short, but I've decided that I'm going to go on my own terms, and it may be earlier than I would have otherwise lived or at least existed. We get into the quality of life discussions.
Exactly.
And
you've touched on it right there. My description of Brittany from the outset of just this determined free spirit, she certainly was going to live life on her terms. To be clear, though, at that point, the only thing Brittany's doing, or the only thing that she's saying, is that she wants to know that she has that option. The hope is that she doesn't have to utilize the medication. Her hope is that hospice, palliative care, that modern medicine will be able to keep her comfortable, for her final few weeks or days on this green earth. But the reality, and a simple search on the internet will inform a person of what they're likely to suffer from, and pain that not even morphine can alleviate, seizures, personality changes, the inability to sleep for days on end, the nausea, the vomiting, some of those things she was experiencing, and what's coming next as the tumor grows, blindness, paralysis, being stuck in bed and dying as a suffering mass. Brittany's like, there's no way that is going to be the way that her life ends. So you're right. That is a tough conversation to have. And Brittany and I, we talked about that, and then she was sharing that with her parents. But in a sense, for me, very quickly, I recognized if the roles were reversed, if it was me, I would have been saying the same thing to her. If shit gets bad, we have to move to Oregon.
Yeah.
And so that's all it was. And again, I emphasize it just so the listeners, that they recognize at that point, the only thing she is doing is making sure that she has the end of life options, all of them available to her. And that includes hospice, palliative care, all the clinical trials, everything. We're pursuing all of it. But that certainly in her mind has to be one of them, because of the way that brain cancer can end her life. And it is a pretty horrific ending, or it can be.
Well, Dan, I mean, can we talk about what California wasn't offering that prompted the move out of state?
Sure. Yeah. So at that point, when Brittany died, there were only 4 states that afforded a terminally ill individual this option of medical aid in dying. And I'll cover what the parameters of that are in a second. Those 4 states were Oregon, Washington, Vermont, and Montana. And so in California, we didn't have this option at that time, which is why Brittany spoke up, which is why she made that initial video that garnered 12 million views and everything else. She was simply saying it was an injustice. Why did we have to leave our home in California so that she would have this option? If we stay in California, she's got to navigate this thing, and things can get pretty dicey and pretty bad. If we're in Oregon, then she has this option. And the option, as far as the parameters of it, 2 physicians independent of one another have to agree this person is terminally ill with 6 months or less to live. That person has to be mentally competent. They make the request both verbally and in writing. There's a 15-day waiting period in between. There are witnesses involved. Those are all the safeguards. And that process is not a simple one, navigating all of that. The biggest safeguard, once a person applies for, qualifies for, and is granted the prescription, and by the way, the prescription it's a sleeping medicine. Sequebarbital is the name of it. It's been around for over 80 years. I mention it just to demystify it because people think, oh, it's it's something that is administered through an IV. That's euthanasia. Anything administered to a person in an IV, that's illegal in all 50 states. The biggest safeguard, and there was a whole process preparing that medication, the biggest safeguard is that the terminally ill individual has to be able to consume that medication on her own. There's 100 capsules of that sequelbarbital. We had to open each of those capsules. It's put into a glass, and then the powder is mixed with like 4 or 5 ounces of water, and Brittany has to be able to consume that on her own. So that's what the process is, and that's what Brittany simply wanted to know, that she has that available to her if things continued, those symptoms continued to progress the way that they were.
So are states like California arguing that, hey, it's a slippery slope if we give Brittany the choice to take control over her own life and death? Well, before you know it, we will have slid ourselves into a place where it's death by convenience or the death panels and all those types of things. I mean, you've heard the arguments, right?
And so what you've touched on, the promise that I made to Brittany is that I would help work to pass legislation in more states so that no terminally ill individual would ever have to leave home like we did after being told, they have 6 months to live. So I mentioned initially there were 4 states. Now, in just the past 4.5 years since Brittany died, we're now up to 10 states. And the ones that have joined, that we've passed legislation in since then is California, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, New Jersey, and most recently Maine. Actually, as you and I are talking, New Jersey's law went into effect just yesterday. So the impact that Brittany's story made on this topic, it just made people recognize this is sound legislation. Nationwide support for medical aid in dying. 72% of the population agrees with Brittany that a terminally ill individual should have this option. So I'm in good company. Brittany's in good company that there is that wide support. The reason that it simply hadn't passed in California is the same reason that it hasn't passed in all the other states that I've traveled to. The arguments that you just put forth or that you mentioned are the ones the opponents are constantly trying to muddy the waters and put out there, slippery slope, and all of a sudden there's going to be people marching down the street, euthanizing everybody. No, that's not how this program works. An individual has to go through the steps that I highlighted of applying for, and the 2 physicians and all those safeguards. In Oregon, just because we have 20 years of data from there, the number of individuals who utilize this last year, I think that number was 132. This is a very small, they have a population of 3.5 million. In California, we have a population of 40 million people in California. The number of individuals who qualified for this was, I think, 530 something. The number of individuals who used it was 377, I think. I should have called up we have 3 years worth of data now from California, but I'll look it up, but those numbers are pretty close. My point in mentioning this is that this program has very judiciously and carefully been implemented. It's not a slippery slope.
I hear those numbers, though, and I also hear the word option. Like, some people took the option not to do it. It's not a foregone conclusion that if someone is legally allowed to do this. I'm guessing is there psychological testing as well? Do they make you go through that protocol?
If a physician, in having the conversation with a person who's applying for it, that safeguard of mental competency, that's exactly it. If a physician says this person, maybe they're just suffering through a bout of depression, they're despondent, that physician would then refer that patient to say, I'm going to have you speak with my colleagues, and they're going to ensure that that person has the mental capacity. But the one thing that you mentioned, I said that it was 500 and some number that qualified for and received the medication, and the number of individuals who utilized it was like 377. More than a third of the individuals who qualify for and receive it, they end up not utilizing it. They die of their underlying disease without needing to take the medication. that, as you mentioned, it speaks to the strength of this legislation. It is an option. From the minute that the person decides, like Brittany, that she's applying for it, to the day, and again, hopefully that day doesn't come, but to the day that she decided to utilize it, because in her case, that pain that she was feeling at the base of her skull was just getting worse. Those seizures were getting more severe. She said that she would rather be able to pass away gently.
So she just looks you in the eye and she's like, I think tomorrow's the day?
Well, the decisions that she was making because that is a question, and that's one that I've had that question a lot. People say, well, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know the day? How do you know when you have suffered enough? And for her, it was the increasing symptoms and the severity of what she was experiencing. And also every month or whenever we would get the new scan, the MRIs, the physicians, they could point to and say, well, you're probably experiencing some of this because it's growing, it's continuing to expand in these sections of your brain, et cetera. So, for her, it wasn't this impulsive, I'm having a bad headache today and that's it. No, it's that when you're suffering through your days, you're not living through them, but you're only suffering through them, then that's the determination, of course, that only the individual can make.
Well, Dan, you said you'd answered the question a lot, and that's because in the years since, you have been an activist on this subject. You have lent your voice to discussions about right-to-die issues. And I guess that's kind of where I want to finish. I mean, what work are you doing, and how can we support it?
The promise I made was to help pass this legislation in honoring Brittany. That is what I continue to do. I've been to 14 different state capitals across the country. And if somebody is interested in learning more about Brittany's story, getting involved, there is a site, thebrittanyfund.org, and Brittany is spelled Brittany. So thebrittanyfund.org, which is linked to the nonprofit compassionandchoices.org. And right there, a person can look up by state what's going on in their state, if what legislators, who's sponsoring the bill number, how they can get involved. The programs that Brittany advocated for and what I continue to advocate for, it contains those guidelines and protections that I mentioned as far as a patient applying for and qualifying for it if they meet those criteria. There are other organizations out there, and they use other means to working with terminally ill patients, and that's fine. But I just, as a way of differentiating, I advocate for the laws as it applies to what Brittany had to go through and pursue. And I'm not by way of passing judgment on the others, but I am just careful to say that the medical aid in dying legislation that we've put forth contains those safeguards. If there are other organizations out there working on their own thing, that's totally fine, and they can do that. But that is different than what Brittany was advocating.
Dan, then, is there a specific organization that reflects the angle that you are taking?
Yes, and that is Compassion and Choices. Compassionandchoices.org is their website. That is the group, a nonprofit group. They've been around for over 30 years. And Compassion and Choices is the organization that hosted Brittany's video. And it is the group that, the nonprofit organization that I continue to work alongside. They have a great team on the legislative side, identifying states where we have opportunities. And then in California, once a law is passed, it's then the implementation, working with physicians, working with medical institutions to get them up to speed, to provide the training. And then the third aspect of what they do is defending the law. The day that we passed this law in California, or the day that the law went into effect, the very following day, there was a group who filed a lawsuit to try to block it. Well, that group is their angle, while they'll claim that, there's issues with the law and they're concerned about the safeguards. Yeah, the majority of the plaintiffs in there, they're very religious. This is coming from their own religious beliefs and their attempt to impose those beliefs onto the rest of California. Support for California, in California, by the way, is 75%, so it's even higher than the national average. So to me, that's kind of offensive that that group would literally sue in court to try to overturn the law. They found a judge in Riverside County that was sympathetic to their cause. And for a period of about 3 weeks last year, the law was not available. And very quickly got involved, Compassionate Choices, the state of California, and made sure the law was back in effect. And now it's continued going through the appellate court. It went to the Supreme Court of California. So all those efforts, that's Compassionate Choices, leading that charge to defend this legislation.
I'm so sorry for what happened to you and Brittany. The words just fall so flat. I know that you hear it all the time. I'm very sorry for your loss. And, it's difficult to try to communicate in a way that you feel really helps because it just feels kind of vacuous and trite. But just know it comes from a good place. For lack of better words, I'm so sorry for what happened to you and to Brittany,
Seth, I appreciate that. And that just, to me, it solidifies my faith in mankind, human beings, of that, yes, we are compassionate and caring people.
Yeah.
And one thing I did want to share is that while support for this nationwide is 72%, as I mentioned, the biggest opposition in every state I've been to, here in California, the same, comes from, unfortunately, the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic. I was an altar boy. I went to Catholic school, the whole 9 yards, confirmation, all of it. Brittany was the one who she would boast that she was an atheist. But I just wanted to take a moment to mention that, interestingly, support amongst Catholics is 70%. So while the church leadership, they have their position of being opposed, and that's fine. They're entitled to that. The people, the congregation, the people sitting in the pews, they agree with her. This is not a religious issue. This is not a political issue. This is a medical issue. And when I show up at state houses, or if people get involved and share stories of their own loved ones, I think that's where the emphasis needs to be placed. This is not up for a politician or a judge to tell any of us how our final few days might play out. This is an individual working with their physicians, working with the support of their families, and within their own set of spiritual beliefs to determine how is their end. How will that come? Endings matter, and we only get to do that once. Brittany just wanted to make sure it would be a gentle dying process and not suffering horrifically.
She was something very special. You'd mentioned that she'd done a video. It's called A Video for All My Friends. It was posted on the Compassion Choices website. And I'd like to play the audio of that. It's a 5-minute clip with her on camera. It features her. You're in it briefly, and then her mother. And it's just kind of a farewell, and this is what's happened and why and what's going on in my head. And, she obviously felt she could say it better than anyone else, and she certainly did. So I'd like to end the broadcast with that. But beyond that, you're making a tremendous difference, and it is an honor to have had you on the show to talk about her, to talk about this important issue. Death is part of life. We have to destigmatize it. It's just, especially in this country, it seems like people don't want to talk about it, or they just shrug and say, well, we leave it up to God, which means we let people suffer. And I think, you mentioned a medical issue. It's really a human rights issue, right? We want to end suffering, and you're helping to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
To finish the broadcast, I would like to leave you with the audio of a video that was published the 29th of October, 2014 by Compassionate Choices. This audio features the voice of Brittany Menard herself. The video was titled, A Video for All My Friends. Thank you so much for listening.
So if November 2nd comes along and I've passed, I hope my family is still proud of me and the choices I made. And if November 2nd comes along and I'm still alive, I know that we'll just still be moving forward as a family, out of love for each other, and that decision will come later. When people criticize me for not not like waiting longer or, whatever they've decided is best for me. It hurts because really I risk it. I risk it every day that I wake up. And I do it because I still feel good enough, and I still have enough joy, and I still laugh and smile with my family and friends enough that it doesn't seem like the right time right now. But it will come because I feel myself getting sicker. It's happening each week. I still get out and do what I can. I walk with my husband. I walk with my family and my dogs. And things like that bring me the greatest feelings of health that I have these days. But really, it's been just since January 1st, since my diagnosis, it's like health-wise, things keep just getting worse. But I guess that's what happens when you're terminally ill, is you get sicker and sicker.
It sounds so cliche. We take things one day at a time, but that's the only way to get through this. You take away all of the material stuff, all the nonsense that we all seem to latch onto as a society, and you realize that those moments are really what matter.
So the worst thing that could happen to me is that I wait too long because I'm trying to seize each day, but that I somehow have my autonomy taken away from me by my disease because of the nature of my cancer. To really talk to you about the most terrifying aspects. Most recently, my most terrifying set of seizures was about a week or so ago. I had 2 in a day, which is unusual. And I remember looking at my husband's face at one point and thinking, I know this is my husband, but I can't say his name. And ended up going to the hospital for that one. It's a weird feeling to wake up every day and be in my body because it feels so different than it did just a year ago. To be perfectly candid, in the last 3 months, I've gained over 25 pounds, and over nothing I've put in my mouth except for prescription medications. I don't like being photographed. I don't like being filmed, and I don't like spending a lot of time looking in the mirror. And I'm not full of self-hate or loathing. It's just that my body has changed so quickly. You really kind of stop recognizing yourself in a way, and that's very personal. I think sometimes people look at me and they think, well, you don't look as sick as you say that you are. Which hurts to hear, because when I'm having a seizure and I can't speak afterwards, I certainly feel as sick as I am.
It's not my job to tell her how to live, and it's not my job to tell her how to die. It's my job to love her through it.
Well, if all my dreams came true, I would somehow survive this. But I most likely won't. So, beyond that, I am, having been an only child for my mother, I want her to recover from this and not break down, not suffer from any kind of depression. And my husband is such a lovely man. I want him to, I understand everyone needs to grieve, but I want him to be happy. So I want him to have a family. And I know that might sound weird, but there's no part of me that wants him to live out the rest of his life just missing his wife. So I hope he moves on and becomes a father. My goal, of course, is to influence this policy for positive change, and I would like to see all Americans have access to the same healthcare rights. But beyond that public policy goal, my goals really are quite simple, and they mostly do boil down to my family and friends, and making sure they all know how important they are to me and how much I love them.
you.